You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of GHS-TV's award-winning talk show Crosstalk. I'm your host, Scarlett Simpson. Each week in this time slot, we take a look at different issues, personalities, and events that affect you and our community. On Veterans Day, we recognize the brave people who have fought to protect our country. From World Wars I and II to Vietnam and Iraq, the wars we fought over the past 100 years have defined who we are as a nation. Today, we will dig deeper into how these wars affected the veterans who fought in them and what's being done to help them. But first, let's discuss the geopolitics of war with Stephen Stein, Professor of War at University of Memphis. Mr. Stein, thank you so much for being on our show today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, the concept of war has been around since the beginning of mankind, really. But why is it after thousands of years it is still a common threat in world affairs?
Well, that's a question that's puzzled philosophers for centuries, and you essentially have two arguments. Hume on one end, basically saying that violence is inherent to our nature, and people like the great French philosopher Rousseau at the other saying that civilization makes us violent, that left to our own innate nature we'd be peaceful.
Can you talk about what started the war in Vietnam?
Well, the war in Vietnam has very long roots, mixed in with French colonialism. The French colonized the entire region, what they called Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia today. In the late 19th century, they were expelled at the outset of World War II by Japan, and then after World War II, the French returned to reoppose their rule, and in doing so inherited what was already a fairly active anti-colonial movement, the Viet Minh. French, to make a long story short, lost that war, but the U.S. was already substantially supporting the French by 1952-53. The U.S. is paying about half the cost of the war because of larger Cold War issues, because we wanted France as a partner in NATO. And we inherited France's commitment to the region. We arranged the partition of Vietnam into two countries, South Vietnam and North Vietnam. And after a few years of relative peace, guerrilla warfare led by communists resumed in the South. And the U.S. leaders, believing they had an obligation to oppose communists wherever they appeared, increasingly supported the South Vietnamese government. And by 1965, the South Vietnamese government was losing the war, and the U.S. at that point, we already had 16,000 advisors in Vietnam by 1963. In 1965, we committed ground forces, U.S. Marines first and later Army units.
Well, we are decades removed from Vietnam, but are there misconceptions now about the war?
Well, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the Vietnam War, depending on who you talk to. It was a very long war, it was a very divisive war, and became more divisive over time. There are still people who believe that journalists, for example, betrayed the American cause, which of course wasn't true. There are people in the military who blame the politicians for losing the war. There are politicians who blame the military for losing the war, when in fact both bear significant responsibility for mismanaging a war, and a war that maybe the U.S. should not have gotten involved in the first place.
Well, both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were started in the wake of 9/11. Mr. Stein, I know they are both complicated issues, but could you briefly discuss each one?
Well, the initial one, of course, was Afghanistan, in which there was a direct link to the 9/11 attacks. The terrorists that launched the attacks on September 11th had been sheltered in Afghanistan for some time. They had a very close relationship with the Taliban, who then ruled large parts of Afghanistan. And it made sense to go after them there because that at the time was where the leadership was, Osama bin Laden and others of his lieutenants. The war in Iraq, of course, didn't begin until 2 years later. And while the U.S. received substantial support from our allies going into Afghanistan, it in fact remains the only time the NATO alliance has ever been activated, we got a lot less support for going into Iraq. At the time, the Bush administration argued that if we went into Iraq, removed Saddam Hussein, who was a problem not because he supported Osama bin Laden, but because he had done all sorts of other things against the United States and to support terrorism, the Bush administration genuinely believed that if we could stabilize and democratize Iraq, that stability would then spread throughout the Middle East.
Well, we brought up misconceptions about the war, but for Vietnam specifically and Iraq, many people say that the government had lied to Americans in order to get support for the war. What is your take on that?
The government certainly misled the American people, the Johnson administration in the late 60s, as did our senior commander there, General Westmoreland, by repeatedly telling the American people that victory was at hand, light was at the end of the tunnel, as they kept saying, when in fact they knew that the war was not going terribly well. And of course, their lies, unfortunately, were revealed by the Tet Offensive, when Vietnamese communist guerrillas struck every major city and town in South Vietnam simultaneously, which was a pretty solid demonstration that the United States was not winning the war.
No matter the outcome, war takes a toll on a country, especially emotionally. Can you touch on that?
Well, Vietnam has been very interesting. The Vietnam War ended when I was not much older than probably you are today. And I remember in the 1970s that veterans did not admit that they were veterans frequently. They did not admit they served in Vietnam. And the interesting thing that changed in the 1980s is not only did the veterans themselves come out and demand recognition for their service, but you increasingly got people who claimed to be veterans who weren't. So simply how veterans were seen in American society dramatically changed between the 1970s and 1980s. And I think that's continued in our society. I think Americans take military service a lot more seriously than they used to, even though fewer of us serve in the military than probably any time in the last 80 years.
Well, Mr. Stein, thank you so much for being on the show today and for shedding light on our military history.
Oh, sure. Happy to be here.
We have to take a short break, but when we return, we will continue our discussion with a Vietnam veteran. Stay with us.
I wish I was in school. If only I had a math test today. I'll stay after class. I'll clean the chalkboard. I wish I was in school.
School ends, but free lunches for your kids don't have to. Find your local food bank at feedingamerica.org/summer meals for help.
Hello and welcome to Cable Quiz, the academic.
Do you know how incredible it is to work at a TV station in high school?
GHS-TV is a student-run television station.
There's so many things you can do here at GHS-TV. You can be in front or behind the camera or both. You have that opportunity. There are no limits.
We have sports and we have news and we have entertainment. So the students here get a well-rounded view of what it's like to be in the TV field.
It's my life. It's what I want to do.
From all of us here at GHS-TV, thanks for starting your morning with us. For more information about the Kappa program, visit ghskappa.com or call 755-7775. You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
To leave Vietnam to its fate would shake the confidence of all these people in the value of an American commitment.
It's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it.
That's whistling. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but that's the sound of a 155mm shell going overhead. Very nervous. Everybody dry-mouthed and waiting for the first machine gun or the first rifle shot.
Congress gave us this authority
to do whatever may be necessary. That's pretty far-reaching. That's the sky's the limit.
There are 150,000 Americans in Vietnam.
So that someone's got to go over there, and that someone isn't me.
For the first time in the Vietnam War, American unit casualties were described as moderate. The bullets were coming from everywhere, they said. They were right on top of us.
It was pretty bad to listen to your friends crying out for help, not being able to do a thing.
I want to congratulate you on your distinguished victory. You fought bravely, you fought with skill.
Just about as close to being to hell as you can get and come out alive.
Aim, turn, ready, two.
So I wish you well, Sarge, give 'em hell, kill me 1,000 or so. And if you ever get a war without blood and gore, I'll be the first to go.
Hello and welcome back to Crosstalk. Here in Memphis, there are more than 35,000 veterans. This week, in honor of Veterans Day, we are focusing on U.S. wars and the veterans who witnessed them firsthand. One of those veterans joins us now, Sherman Austin, who fought in the Vietnam War. Mr. Austin, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, can you tell us your experience in the military as well as your time in Vietnam?
It was interesting. Vietnam was very traumatic. As a matter of fact, boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, I'm a Marine, was very traumatic, but we made it through with a little grit and gravy.
Yes. Well, 2/3 of the soldiers who fought in Vietnam were volunteers, but they also had draft lotteries. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted. I volunteered. Went in with some of my classmates on a buddy plan, and we went through basic training together. After basic, we were separated and we went our individual ways, but we all ended up in Vietnam.
Well, knowing what we know now about the Vietnam War, would you have still enlisted?
I think so. I believe so. I think when you look back, there were more good times than bad. It was interesting. Some aspects of it was devastating, but yeah, I would do it again.
Well, you mentioned how you came into the war with your friends, but I'm sure that once you got into the war, it was different than what you expected.
Very much so. I did not expect things to be as traumatic as they were, and as a matter of fact, getting to Vietnam and going out to my company that I was assigned to, we got ambushed. I'm brand new in Vietnam, and all of a sudden it popped in my mind, hey, these people are trying to kill us. So that was a wake-up call, if you will.
Well, Mr. Austin, how did you get through the war?
God's grace and experiences from the Marine Corps in basic training and advanced infantry training, learning, just learning about war and all the aspects of war, period. I had some close friends and classmates who did not make it back, so sort of the luck of the draw and God's grace.
Well, how did your service and experiences in Vietnam affect your life?
Well, I think I am more appreciative of life, period, now, after my service in the military in Vietnam. And I'm more appreciative of family. And really, I've done a little bit of a retrospect at our country. And having traveled around the world and seeing a lot of the world, a lot of things you don't take for granted anymore. You get serious about what you have and what you're exposed to, and every day is a day of Thanksgiving.
Well, do you know anyone with mental battle scars such as PTSD?
Yeah. You're looking at one.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. How do you get through the day-to-day life with PTSD?
Well, you go through it, you realize that you have it and you deal with it. Of course, there are many aspects to it. There's medication, there's counseling, and all of the above. But I think you just don't dwell on it. You know, you realize you have it, but you just don't sit there and have a pity party for yourself. You move on, understanding the fact that this is here, I got to deal with it, and I'm just going to go forward.
Well, did your military experience change the way that you view war or the military in general?
I think it changed the way that I view both war and the military. Having been a frontline participant, I think I take both services seriously now. The military service and the service as you know, a war combatant. They both are taken very serious by me now.
Well, in light of recent events around the world, what are some of the ways that we can prevent another war from starting, or is there any way to prevent it?
I don't know if there's a way of preventing it. You know, we've had wars and rumors of war since the beginning of time, and there are always conflicts with mankind. We can try to be more diplomatic. You know, we can, you know, exert diplomacy. But I think war is just a part of life and a part of living. We try as hard as possible to avoid it, but it's here.
Well, Mr. Austin, do you remember the day that your service ended?
Yeah.
What did it feel like?
April 30th, 1969 was the day. It felt good, felt interesting. It felt gratifying, and I looked back in retrospect and I said, wow, you know, I'm being separated from my military service, and I kind of pinched myself to make sure that I'm all here, and sort of did a retrospective on my friends that I was leaving behind and the one who didn't make it back from Vietnam, and I felt very gratified, very gratified.
Well, Mr. Austin, thank you so much for being on the show today, and thank you for your service towards our country.
Thank you for the work that you do.
We have to take another short break, but when we return, we will touch more on the topic of war and the effect it has had on our soldiers. Stay with us.
One of the things that sets us apart from other schools or other productions that are doing this is that our kids are 100% in charge of what they're doing.
We sell the ads, we build the stage, we make the costumes.
Working in this environment, I've learned to appreciate everything that's given to me because not many high schools have programs like this.
When I first started in this program, my first musical was Hairspray. And now, 4 years later, I'm in my last musical, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. And looking back, I think I've progressed a lot.
To see them now as seniors and to see the people that they have become, it's changed me more than I think it's changed them.
For more information about the CAPA program, visit GHS-Kappa.com or call 755-7775. You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
It was unbelievable, you know. It looked like a quarterback calling an audible on the line. And he's going, small arms fire, 11 o'clock.
Hey, Sergeant Foster, I want to shoot a small D at that building. And he could see right in it, saw where the guy was shooting from. And I was like, yeah, shoot it, man, go ahead. I heard Chandler scream, so I turned around and realized Chandler wasn't running behind me. And Chandler, which was pretty amazing, he was trying to climb back up. He was kind of moaning and everything, but he was still with it. He was trying to climb back up the ditch so he could get back in the fight.
I started receiving effective fire to where I couldn't get my head over the sandbag, so I was eating dirt at the time.
It just continued to come, and waves just continued to come.
The call was made, hey, are you receiving fire from the Red Door compound? Roger that.
It reminds Sergeant Spear of another famous fight of the 101st Airborne in the Battle of the Bulge, surrounded by the Nazis in the village of Bastogne.
The fight that we had was similar in regards to the fact that, yes, we were surrounded, and there was no way we would surrender due to the heritage that we have and the willingness to fight.
That was a look at Operation Dragon Strike that took place in Afghanistan during 2010. Hello and welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Scarlett Simpson. While knowing the history of war is key to understanding how it has affected the world today, knowing how to help the soldiers who were traumatized by war is just as important. Here with us now is Iraq and Afghanistan veteran and Purple Heart recipient Robert Hunt and NeuroSource psychologist Dale Foster. Dr. Foster, Mr. Hunt, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Scott.
Well, Mr. Hunt, you received 2 Purple Hearts on the same day. Would you mind telling us what happened?
It was August 14th, 2006. I was in Baghdad. We were doing an escort of an Iraqi official from one base to another. Our convoy came under attack. We were ambushed. Once we cleared the ambush, we had to send up reports, and I was trying to keep people into certain situations to recover vehicles and equipment, and I was shot by a sniper. It was a single round, went through the back of my head, exited through the front. It knocked me out for a little bit. I got up, got back into the fight. We tried to get back to our base, and on the way I was hit by an IED.
Well, not a lot of people can say that they fought in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Can you tell us about your time in the military?
The military was probably the best time of my life. Made a tremendous amount of friends. I got to see many places around the world, and I got to do neat and interesting stuff.
Well, we all know why we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, but why did you decide to join the fight? Was it a calling?
I had enlisted in 1995, so I was already on active duty for 6 years prior to 9/11. I remember watching the attacks of 9/11 unfold live on TV, and I knew exactly what was going on, and I knew that I was going to be going. It was just a matter of time.
Well, Dr. Foster, many soldiers come back from war with post-traumatic stress disorder. What are some of the symptoms?
Well, the classic symptom is the flashback. You have a memory that comes back to you that's traumatic, and you re-experience the trauma when the memory comes back, and it can make you hypervigilant, on edge, interrupt sleep, cause nightmares, cause constant irritability, even depression, and even if it's not a flash of a memory, just sort of an uneasy, constant, low-level anxiety can just go with you everywhere you go and make you afraid when you don't know why. And you can have symptoms in a crowded place and you don't know why, and it can make you avoid people. It can make you have difficulty communicating because you can't explain it sometimes. And so those are the classic symptoms, but a lot of other symptoms accompany it. Just chronic anxiety can cause ongoing stress. You may have headaches, you may lose your appetite, you may have difficulties with relationships, and all of those things are just disruption of your entire nervous system.
Well, how common is it within soldiers?
It's very common. Mr. Hunt mentioned the IED, the improvised explosive device. It was something that came about in Afghanistan. They started happening around 2003, and upwards of 900,000 injuries occurred with IEDs in Afghanistan and Iraq. And when you are blown up, literally blown up, even numerous times for a lot of people, then you start to develop these post-traumatic stress symptoms. And most of the time, you're thrown back in the fight because You have to be. You have to survive and you have to continue, and you don't get the time to recover. And so it's very common, and it's a high percentage of people returning after those types of injuries do have post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well, Mr. Hunt, did any of your multiple tours have any effects on you physically, mentally, or emotionally?
I believe they did. I mean, I'm human, so everything will affect me. I did lose friends while I was there. I was injured while I was there. And even to this day, I still am in contact with friends that are serving, that have deployed numerous times. So it's hearing their stories and the continuation of what they go through, it does affect me.
Well, Dr. Foster, what resources are available for service members, veterans, and their families?
Well, of course, the Memphis Veterans Administration Hospital will help you if you have post-traumatic stress disorder, and they also work with me. There's sort of a line of treatment. First line is talk therapy and medication, and then there's exposure therapy, and quite often those don't work simply because it's a brain-related issue, and the best way to rehabilitate the brain is to train the brain. So that's something that's kind of new. It's called neurofeedback, and you can directly three-dimensionally neuroimage the brain and train the regions of the brain that have been damaged. Of course, when you've been blown up, you're going to damage the brain, but then the emotional damage, in addition to the physical damage, have to be addressed, and they're both there.
Well, finally, do you think there's a stigma for war veterans who are seeking help with their PTSD, and why? Dr. Foster, we'll start with you.
There is less stigma now than there used to be. The idea of post-traumatic stress disorder being a real thing that's in the brain. It's not just someone trying to avoid working or avoid contact. They're literally physiologically injured. And now we know that with neuroscience, we can neuroimage the brain and see that this brain is injured. It's not someone making this up. And so with science, the stigma has decreased dramatically, but some people still feel guilty. And that sometimes goes with the post-traumatic stress, because you may have seen a friend die and you may feel guilty that you didn't die. And then you may feel guilty that you're seeking help and someone who did die can't get help. So it's a complex situation, and cognitive therapy is important, but direct training the brain is something that can be even faster to aid recovery.
Well, Dr. Foster, Mr. Hunt, thank you so much for being on the show today. And Mr. Hunt, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you know anyone who may be experiencing or possibly struggling with PTSD or any mental illness, please don't hesitate and go to neurosource.net or call them at 901-624-0100. Remember, Crosstalk can be seen each week at 9:30 a.m. and 7 p.m. on Mondays and Thursdays, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 a.m. and 12 p.m. and 7 p.m. on Sundays. For more information on our programming, please check us out on the web at GHS-TV.org, where we are streaming live 24 hours a day. You can also check us out on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Scarlett Simpson from all of us at GHS-TV. Thank you for watching Crosstalk, and I hope to see you again.